My name is Retna Hanani. I'm lecturer at Public Administration Department, one of the lecturer in the Introduction to Public Administration course. And on behalf of the lecturers in this course, I would like to welcome you all. And thank you so much for your attendance. And I wish to see a very fruitful discussion that we are going to have this evening. And of course, thank you so much to Dr. Hardi Warsono, the Dean of Faculty of Social and Political Science, who is joining with us now. And I know that Pak Hardi is very busy and we are very grateful. Thank you so much, Pak, that amid his busy schedule, he's still willing to deliver his opening speech and officially open the guest lecture. And thank you again. And we'll start a little bit later after I introduce our guests this evening. I'm very happy to welcome and to see Dr. Lonce Sandy Bailey again. We met in 2012, many years ago. And thank you so much, Lonce, for sharing your time with us. Sorry about the time mixed up, so but I'm glad that we can sort it out. And thank you very much. Dr. Lonce Sandy Bailey is a lecturer, associate professor at Shippensburg University. We met during the SUSI program funded by U.S. State Department, and I learned a lot from Dr. Bailey, especially on the American public administration system. And of course, I believe that he will share very valuable insight for us today. And Dr. Hartuti Purnaweni will be the moderator of this evening. Dr. Hartuti Purnaweni is Associate Professor at the Faculty of Social and Political Science, my senior colleague in the Introduction to Public Administration course. So yeah, I'm very happy to host this evening session. Okay, I think without further ado, I think we can start with the opening remarks from Dr. Hardi Warsono, the Dean of Social and Political Science, to deliver his opening speech and, of course, to officially open the guest lecture. Time and screen are yours, Pak Hardi. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, Honorable Manager at the I'm sorry. At the Department of Public Administration, Dr. Tri Yuningsih MSc, Head of Department, Dr. Randa Maisaro MSc, Head of Study Program of Public Administration, Mr. Amni Zarkasi, SAP MSc, Secretary of Study Program of Public Administration, Honorable Speaker, Professor, Associate Professor, Dr. Lonce Bailey, am I right?
Yes, Lonce Bailey, yeah.
Lonce Bailey from Shippensburg University in the United States, speaker today. Dr. Hartuti Purnaweni, MPA, and Ms. Retna Hanani, MSc. They are as a lecturer on this great class. Moderator, distinguished guests, Professor, Kolega, Committee, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences at Universitas Diponegoro, I would like to kindly welcome you all to our General Lecture series held by the Department of Public Administration. I feel excited and privileged to have the opportunity to open and present this highly academic program to all of us, even though the world is still facing crisis due to the disruption caused by COVID-19. Thanks to all of you. I am happy to welcome Associate Professor Dr. Lonce Bailey in the United States and all the faculties and students who have spared the time to attend the guest lecture from the International Undergraduate Program of Public Administration. The guest lecture seminar is organized by the Department of Public Administration, the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences, Universitas Diponegoro, to gain insight and discuss the latest public administration theory development. We are eager to learn and share with other partners on conceptualizing the ever-changing dynamic of public administration as a field of study. On this occasion, we are particularly interested in learning and sharing with Dr. Lonce on the role of politics and cultural context in shaping public policy and administration. Your talk this evening is a keynote address to open the introduction to the public administration course this semester. Therefore, we hope that the session will be a foundation to our students to think about public administration and public policy in comparative manner. Likewise, if there is one single most precious lesson we should learn from the unfortunate pandemic we face today, then it should be on how unprecedented and fragile thing could be that strong economy, powerful military, and established social culture, undertaking having been around and steady for centuries, may still go through some sudden overnight changes caused by some previously understood and insignificant again, and that turn everything around. The pandemic has demonstrated that changes can happen in any given time, and the consequences of such changes can be overwhelming and once are not set and ready for strategies and solutions. We also hope our discussion will be a start of academic cooperation possibilities in the future. Universitas Diponegoro, as one of the top 5 public universities in Indonesia, support different kind of internationalization program, such as student exchange program, joint research, as well as faculty mobility program. As such, once again, we are very happy that Dr. Lonce is with us today. I would like to thank all the individual and partner for their help and contribution in making this webinar or guest lecture possible. I'm especially indebted to the department head, Dr. Yuningsih, MSE and lecturer for assistance and coordination to the whole preparation of this program. My deepest appreciation goes to the committees for organizing this meaningful occasion and the student, participant, and especially the speaker who have been willing to make the time and be here with us in our lecture today. Please do allow me to end this remark by wishing you all a delightful and informative talk and discussion. By saying Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, Department of Public Administration General Lecture Series entitled The Role of Politics and Cultural Contact in Shaping Public Policy and Administration is officially open. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Ms. Ratna Harani.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pak, for your sharp opening remarks. And now we can go straight to the discussion moderated by Dr. Hartuti Purnaweni. Please, Bu Hartuti, time is yours.
We are very happy, yeah, especially Bu Hana and me. Yeah, we teach this public administration course, and we have 2 classes this semester, and we have been communicating with the students who are very happy to have you, Dr. Lonce. Yeah, and since public administration is actually the birth of a public administration was in the United States. So then the discipline then become flourish, yeah, all over the world. And so it will be very interesting to hear a lecture from someone from the United States where this discipline come from. So I would like to introduce Dr. Lonce Bailey first. He got his master's degree in the political science in the University of Virginia. And his PhD is also in political science in 2006 in the University of Massachusetts, right? And Dr. Lonce Bailey, very interested in doing research, especially in the public budgeting processes and the democratic governance, and also in the relation between state and bureaucracy and democracies in the United States. And since we are from Indonesia, we have a kind of different systems in terms of politics, which is the introduction to public administration, and especially the role of politics in the cultural context. Like in Indonesia, we have a certain cultural context which may different from the, which for sure different from the United States. And probably you are going to also talk about how the cultural context will influence the processes and the practices of public administration and between the two countries. So I don't know how is your lecture going to be on, but I'm sure that it will be very interesting for us and especially for our students to hear. So time is yours, Dr. Lonce. Dr. Bailey, sorry. Okay. Yeah, okay.
That's fine. Let me get my slides up here.
Oh yeah. Sorry. Since many of our students are not English speaking, so please try to speak a little bit slowly. Yeah, so your lecture will be more understandable to everyone. Yeah.
Okay,
Okay, thank you very much.
Can you see everything okay?
Yes,
Everything's good.
we do.
You interrupt me if you can't hear me or if I need to slow down. Just tell me to slow down. There's too many people
Okay.
listening, not to make sure everybody's understanding. And I want to thank you from my heart for the invitation to the University of Diponegoro. Did I say that right? Close? And in particular to the Dean, Dr. Warsono, and to our moderator, Dr. Purnaweni. This is a great honor of mine. I've had the pleasure to have many Indonesian teachers and academics come to the United States where we've learned a lot from each other and had spent quite a wonderful times together, many of which I miss. And your society and your culture and your politics have really informed me about my own work over time. And I use examples of Indonesia and things I've learned from Indonesian academics and others in my classes. I have Indonesian art in my house, and even my daughters. I have twin 12-year-old girls. They're let's see if I can find a picture real quick. My 12-year-old daughter. There they are.
They are twins. Okay.
We speak Indonesian every night.
Oh yeah.
We count to 3 in Indonesian. And we do it in several languages, but Indonesian's one of them. So I'm going to say it, and you can let me know if I'm teaching them correctly.
Okay. Okay.
Tana tua tiga. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
I want you to know, in all parts of my life, Indonesia has affected me in very positive ways.
Speaking Indonesia, selamat malam.
And the only other phrase I know is selamat datang. That's it.
Selamat datang.
That's about all I know.
Yeah.
Any case, thank you for inviting me, and especially, of course, to Retna Hanani for offering this information. It's been a long time, and it was a complete honor to have her represent Indonesia here in the United States during our program, and it's great to connect her with her again. So thank you. And I was asked today to talk about sort of political and cultural contexts that are part of our public administration and policy making in the United States. And this is a huge topic, of course, and it can be open to many interpretations. All countries, of course, have political context, and that affects everything from administration to social interaction and to how government works along the way. And so I'm hoping that by highlighting some of our cultural contexts, things that drive our politics, you might notice similarities and differences to yours. And I find that when I learn about other context of other countries, I always learn something about mine. In some ways, it allows me to look at my own country in a more critical or nuanced way. There may be similarities between many countries in terms of technical aspects of policy and administration. So standards for budgeting or ethics, or even how we might organize ourselves in terms of provinces or states or territories along the way. But how things actually work are driven largely by cultural and broader political considerations. Much of this is driven or limited by the historical development of a country, and the US, of course, is no exception. And this is known in many political science and other fields of study as path dependency, which, and this suggests that to fully understand current realities and to understand current policy and current political options, we have to recognize the historical path that has gotten us here. Path dependency is often debated, but clearly just on the face of it, how we did things or why we did things in the past can tell us quite a bit of how we do things now. In the United States, political scientists in the United States, that is, who study historical development and the history of what we would call political institutions, belong to a field of study called American political development. That's my field as well. And when Retna was here, she was exposed to much of that historical development. It's the same kind of focus we have. And academics who study American political development study history and institutions, that is, not necessarily individual behavior, but broader institutional behavior. And they look at major shifts in policy and government programs or major political events over time. I also think that historical development is a great way to sort of understand institutions and practices through a common language. That is, we all have differences in terms of what we've studied or how we think of the world. But one thing that sort of cuts across many disciplines in the social sciences is history, right? That is how we think about how we got to where we are. And so in some ways, I like this approach for these kinds of talks because I think it can give us a common language. We can all relate to history and generational change and major events and how these things impact it. So it's a way for us to connect. Today, I want to share with you my observations about American administration and policy by tracing some major themes and historical trends that explain why we are where we are today in the United States. And I'm hoping in the end you will find a way to compare our experiences in the US to those in Indonesia and find ways in which they differ. Maybe it's a way to sort of highlight these things as I suggested before. For the United States, all things political and administrative in the US begin, at least ideologically, with our founding moment, a very defined, for our country, a very defined moment. It's usually relatively defined in a lot of countries, although sometimes it's more complicated. For Americans, for citizens of the US, the founding moment, so we're thinking George Washington and James Madison and the Revolution, this period of time, about a 15-year period of time. For Americans, the founding moment holds a particularly sacred status. However, what meaning we give to the founding can be a source of great contention. That is, everybody thinks it's important. Everybody likes to quote and reference the founders, but it doesn't necessarily mean we always agree. We know it has great meaning, but it's sometimes in dispute. Americans give great consideration to what founding fathers think, what they might have believed, and what they would do if they were here today. Given the fact there wasn't even electricity at the founding, I think they would be quite surprised. So I want to focus initially on my talk on three main themes that emerge over time and become part of our cultural and political conversation, and really have a big impact on the nature of public administration. I'm sorry about that. I'm having a little bit of a weird thing in my computer there. Okay. See if I get back to where I need to go.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. I want to focus on three main themes that emerge and become part of our political culture and our conversations and has a big impact. The first of these is, of course, democracy, and in particular, what I might call the volume of politics. That is the amount of political interaction that takes place in the United States. The founders in designing the Constitution, in the political debates that generated our Constitution, designed a system that was decentralized with lots of politics. So I don't know how many know this, but in the United States, we have a system of federalism that's very robust. That is, we have a federal government, we have 50 state governments, and then we have tens of thousands of local governments along the way. And each of these have their own politics, their own style, their own design. They have a lot in common, but they also have a lot of independence. They are, that is, states, although they're not free to just simply leave, they are sovereign in that they have control over large parts of people's lives that is separate from the control of the federal government. This has created quite a bit of politics, so that even if I can't have an impact on Washington, D.C., I can have a lot of impact on my schools, on how my roads are built or where they're built, on how we do planning in our city. I can have impact on our state politics and the kinds of laws and regulations and the type of politics we have at the state level. And this was rooted in a few things. We don't have to go into too much detail, but really this decentralization, that is pushing power to lots of parts of the country, was really necessary at the founding to just simply pass the Constitution, to ratify the Constitution. The states saw themselves as very independent at the founding, more so than today, in fact. And so they really had their own experience with self-government. They didn't want to be told what to do by a large national government. Over time, this has changed. We'll get into that a little later. And the national government is much more powerful now than it was at the founding. But we still have many what we call layers of politics. We have many access points in our political system and our process. And by access points, what we mean is places where citizens or citizen groups can have influence or impact on decision making. So there's lots of places where that can take place. We see this if you listen to interviews of former presidents of the United States. They often say one of the things that surprised them the most was how decentralized power was. The president couldn't simply say, I want to do this, and everything happened. They had to convince many different pieces to all agree to do something to get it done. Not in every field. The president has a lot of control over international relations and the military, but almost everything else requires Congress and courts and states and even localities and parties and even members of the president's own cabinet to agree to do things. So power gets decentralized. And one of the reasons why this is most important, and something I think you could probably relate to, is that local politics, which has quite a bit of decision making, local politics and policy really matters to the lives of individuals more than the national government. Right? On a daily basis, my life works or doesn't work based on what the local and state government does. If the United States negotiates a new treaty for nuclear weapons, that's important to me. I'd like to see that done, but it doesn't make a difference in my daily life. And so by having political choice on a local level, it meant that I could engage it personally, right? Or citizens can engage it personally and have some kind of at least perceived impact on this. We could add to this a sense or understanding of class in the United States that was substantially different from what we refer to as the old world, or like, you know, England and Europe, where class distinctions were very severe. In the United States, at least, we saw them, or we see them, or they were interpreted to be much softer. In fact, in the United States, we often think classes are fluid, and then you can move between them. And we have lots of examples of this, of presidents who were born poor. Bill Clinton, for instance, William Clinton, the president, was born in one of the poorest areas of the poorest states in terrible conditions, and he rose to become president. So we see this as evidence of it. In reality, there's not a lot of movement between classes, but there's a perception of it. There's an idea that we are all at some level equal. And one of the great observers of American politics was actually a French public administrator, a gentleman by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville, who some of you might be familiar with. I don't know who reads Tocqueville anymore, but he wrote a really important 2-volume, big, thick book, grab a copy somewhere, called Democracy in America. And he's a French bureaucrat and aristocrat, and he comes to the US to look at public administration, actually, but ends up writing about our democracy. And what he sees is that there's at least this fluid appearance that of equality, of minimization of class distinctions. People talk to each other across classes. They shake hands. They talk on the street. Now, this, of course, doesn't count big problems like in terms of the treatment of women and a terrible system of slavery. But there is this idea that our democracy can be robust and we can be locally decentralized driven because we are equals, right? And it's not just the elites who make decisions, but the common farmer or the common craftsman can move this. That is this sense of equality made for this tumultuous sense of democracy, where there was lots of politics and lots of input, because there's at least a perceived understanding that that we are equal and therefore have equal rights to practice our politics. Now, Tocqueville was worried about these things, and we see some, by the way, we see some of the quotes. I'm assuming you can read them, but you can see he uses this word tumult. No sooner do you set foot on American soil, do you find yourself in a sort of tumult, meaning the classes mingling and lots of discussion. 1,000 voices are heard at once, each expressing some social requirement, some opinion about politics. And what we really see is this kind of idea that government, in many ways, is claimed to be in the hands of the individuals within a society, and therefore we need lots of places in which this democracy can go around. Now, Tocqueville also said this can be really problematic. Democracy isn't self-checking, and so you can have what we would call tyranny of the majority, where the majority would crush the rights of a minority population. The founders also worried about the tyranny of the minority, who could find ways to crush majority populations. But at the end, Tocqueville was both in love with this idea of American democracy and how equality changes the dynamic, but was also very worried about it, and rightfully so. Our problems and our headaches in our democracy can be traced back somewhat to the nature of our democracy. And to this day, we still have lots of democracy. The United States has over 85,000 governmental entities, and that doesn't even include non-elected entities. Most American citizens are governed by at least 6 to 8 governmental bodies, and sometimes twice that number, that can control or tax or limit or arrest me or bring me to court, right? So many, many layers of government that move along. So we have, that's one aspect of our government that in which informs how we go about our policy making in our administration, which I'll bring back in along the way. The next one is the next thing. Democracy is the first one. The next one was individualism. And Retna, you may remember this statue. This is a statue on the campus at UMass of the Minuteman. And I'll talk about the Minuteman in a second, but you might recognize him there. In the United States, individualism is a theme from the founding, which has become even more intense in current day politics and administration. And it can come in different forms. As individualism, we see it expressed in a broader understanding of democracy and of, from a critical standpoint, what we may call mob rule. That is the idea that individuals should be able to govern even at the lowest level, and that elected officials should see the individual as sort of the boss, that all authority flows from the individual. And that concept is common in democracies, right? Authority flows from the individual. That's why elections are important. But what we see in the United States is a sort of individualism that suggests that our revolutionary moment, which was at least viewed as these individuals rising up like the Minuteman, grabbing their rifle from the fireplace and going off to fight the British, is a birthright, is one of our traditions that we should constantly, as individuals, be a threat to government along the way. In some ways, it's, and this is a little more complicated depending on what you study, but in some ways, it's really the most, what I would call, robust form of classical liberalism. So classical liberalism is the idea of course, how democracies function. That is, we would say in a democracy, the people, there's two parts to classical liberalism. In a democracy, the people give up authority and power to government. They consent to be governed, that is. And secondly, that the government is limited. There are limits to government power. And this is different than the divine right of kings or dictatorships or authoritarian rule, where the power is within either one or a small set of people. The authority can flow from different ways, but never from the people. But in classical liberalism, we have limited government, and the power to govern stems from the consent of the governed. And in our case, I think our individualism is particularly robust or particularly vibrant. And that can have both positive and negative meanings, which I'll get to here in a second along the way. Historically, it also has become a type of rugged individualism. The idea that your success or failures in life are largely, if not completely, based on your individual work, that it has little to do with societal forces or assistance from the community or from the government along the way. And so we have all these great images that are very common in the United States, some of which you're probably familiar with. Rambo, of course. And then we see the Western settlers, which was a great migration from the East, settling the newly purchased lands or lands that we actually won during wars, of settlers sort of going out and taking the land. And as an individual, your success or failure all comes onto one person. The Marlboro Man is a great example of how we use it heavily in advertising. We don't see the Marlboro Man anymore. We don't advertise in tobacco as much, but he's really the Marlboro Man. That cigarette commercial was still to this day is a huge iconic understanding of the rugged individual. We even see it in contemporary politics, and not just by former President Trump, but by many politicians. One of his big speech statements he made at many of his rallies was basically, our country is broken, and he would say this exact phrase, I alone can fix it. I am the individual who's going to fix it along the way. This is linked to what some people would call, this comes from a guy named Max Weber, who you're probably familiar with in public administration or will be, to the idea of what's called the Protestant work ethic. And the Protestant work ethic is an idea that your success and your lack of success, but your success, which is based on your own hard work and your own virtue, is a sign that you are chosen as one of God's children, that you are a chosen one of God. And so that if I do well and my land produces crops and I'm able to take care of my family and build a nicer house and have lots of children and have success, that this is a sign that God has blessed me. And in the United States, the Protestant work ethic can explain a lot in terms of individual motivation. The less religious version of that is just simply this idea that my hard work is an outward sign to others of my good qualities, my virtue, of my strengths. It's an outward sign of this, and that it would have much less, if anything, to do with the conditions I was born into, or family money or inheritance, or government programs like free education, or things like this that come along. Now, the question is, why do I bring up individualism? And this I bring up is because it can largely drive policy in the United States, and policy decisions and political opinion about policy. And this is especially true in the last half of the 20th century. So think of after World War II. In the United States, we have more billionaires. It's much easier to become a billionaire in the United States, but it's also much easier to be poor and homeless or destitute, okay? Individualism drives our policy resistance to things like universal health care. We're close to having some version of it, but we're essentially the last country on the planet, certainly the last democracy on the planet, to not have some version of universal health care or universal health insurance. Not to mention other social safety net programs or other public goods. So public universities, which are essentially privately funded, that is, you have to pay your way through, they're very expensive. Other kinds of things in terms of raising children, family support, the lack of family leave. So if you have children in the United States, there is no guaranteed leave from work whatsoever for the man or for the woman, which would be the big one, but not for the man either. So when we compare ourselves to many other Western democracies, we see that we still are resistant to developing programs that recognize challenges that individuals face, that if they didn't have to face them, might free them up to be more engaged in society, more successful, et cetera, et cetera. Even our programs like unemployment insurance, which we have, is much lower funded and supported and less generous than most other Western democracies. Even parts of our healthcare system, our education system has quite a bit of inequality within it. And these are often driven by the idea that it's the individual's responsibility, not society's responsibility. This also, individualism also expresses itself in a version of equality. And again, back to this, what I would call, I don't call, everybody calls a myth, that the classes are fluid, that is, you can move between them, and that the poor, uneducated individual's opinion is as valid and worthy and necessary of listening to as the best educated, most secure individual. And there's something to that makes sense to us. In a democracy, everybody has a vote. In the United States case, we often think that not only does everybody have a vote, but everybody's ideas and opinions should be considered. Which, if you are an administrator, you know how brutally difficult that is, because most policy is very difficult to figure out and to implement. It's highly complex, and it doesn't lend itself to hundreds, if not thousands, of voices coming in within it. Part of this is this idea of class fluidity and equality of the individual. I put on here some covers of 3 books. There's a whole series of them, but I put 3 that made the most sense, by a very famous US author named Horatio Alger. And he wrote these books about the young man. I don't know if he wrote about women or not, but the young man who works hard and saves his money and becomes a titan of society. He owns corporations and becomes a senator. The one in the upper right corner, right, is a great example of this. This risen from the ranks, went from below all the way up, and strive and succeed. Again, these just great themes. And these are to this day are really part of our understanding of individuality, that we have equality of conditions, and if you just work hard enough, you can own the American dream, which is sort of a middle-class existence, and own a home, and that your children will be better off than you are. That American dream doesn't really exist in the way that it might have during certain periods of time. It certainly doesn't exist for large parts of the population, namely ethnic minorities in the United States, and for women, although for women it's changed quite a bit in a lot of ways, but still we find that this doesn't always play out every way. In the modern sense, individualism really in some ways, I would say, in the United States has devolved, that is, has become less impressive to a version of almost like this is a big word, petulant child, like a child who misbehaves, who says, you can't tell me what to do. For many Americans, their individualism is centered on that idea that you can't tell me to wear a mask. You can't tell me to get my vaccine, right? You can't tell me what to do with my property. You can't, that kind of thing, as opposed to embracing what in political theory we would call a thicker version of individuality and of freedom and of individualism. Things like free speech and freedom of religion and freedom of press. These are things worth fighting over. But whether or not I have to wear a mask or not seems pretty simple, right? So in the US, it has changed over time. Am I speaking slow enough?
Yep, it's great.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm getting somewhere here. We're moving on. Okay, you let me know. The next one is one that we would see. Did I get that right? Yep. Okay. The next one we would see in many countries, if not all countries, which is this idea of sort of distrust of government or anti-government sentiment. And in the United States, that was woven into our politics, but it's true of every democracy. And I would say it's true of all parts of the political spectrum in all democracies. I'm making that as a generalization. My guess is it's true in Indonesia as well. So we see it in a variety of settings. And in the United States, anti-government or distrust of government is a tradition. Even if we disagree about what parts of the government we should distrust or in what ways we should distrust them, Americans in general have a distrust for authority. And the very sort of nature of the revolution, the symbol of the revolution is part of this. The idea of a small, poorly armed group of colonists revolting against one of the most powerful militaries the world had ever seen is just woven into our understanding of it. And almost seen, it's almost like a civic religion, really in a lot of ways in that way. We see this in this earlier symbol, I should have put it, the picture here, of the Minuteman. This statue here shows a colonial patriot. Notice he doesn't have a uniform on. He has his hunting rifle with him, and he's looking off into the horizon. This is a statue in Massachusetts, which was the home of the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And the symbol of the Minuteman is a very, they're called a Minuteman because they were available at a minute's notice to come to the arm to defend the state of Massachusetts or whatever state they were in. And this idea of the Minuteman is sort of woven into this piece. That is of resistance, of revolution, even in civil war. To this day in the United States, we still have many people who are proud and revere southern part of the United States, what they call the rebel states, who were defending slavery in the war. Now that seems like a weird thing. Why would you defend a breakaway group that A, lost, B, was treasonous, and C, fought to maintain one of the worst systems of slavery the world has seen? Why would you do that? Because it weaves into this idea of the distrust of government, that there's something honorable about revolting along the way. We see this in early sort of rebellions that in fact led to our founding, and something called Shays Rebellion. After the Revolutionary War, but before the Constitution was written, it's about a 10 to 12 year period, about a 10-year period, not even a 10-year, 8-year period. There was a lot of problems with the moneyed elite, banks basically foreclosing on farmers who were in debt because of the revolution. And those farmers went and grabbed their guns, and they went to a storehouse where they stored more guns and grabbed those to go shoot bankers, right, and to defend their property. In fact, Shays Rebellion, we probably didn't take you there, but Shays Rebellion starts right next to Amherst. Where Mike Hanahan lived, that's where Shays Rebellion began. And anyway, so that was another kind of one of those pieces where it's woven into us. This is particularly true. This is particularly important because, again, of our system of federalism. We have lots of government, and so we have different ways in which we can distrust it. But I think more importantly is in our system of federalism, it allows us to trust local and maybe state government, but distrust federal government more. That is, distant government, distrust of distant government is a major force in the United States, and I would argue is sort of natural to us. That is, if you know your elected officials and you go to the mosque with them, or you have meals with them, or you are neighbors with them, even if you don't agree with them, you can possibly trust them. But to trust someone from another province or another region, you don't know if they even hold the same values that you have, is a much more problematic piece. This anti-government distrust of government is embraced primarily by the conservative movement, or what we call the Republican Party in the United States, although it is expressed through both parties. But this has been a major selling point. This is their major claim, is to be anti-government, the Republican is. Part of this stemmed from the fact that the Republican Party was out of power, substantially out of power, for about 50 years. And so when you're out of power, what is the thing you're going to criticize? The government. The government is bad. It's doing this. It's taking away your freedoms. It's not spending your money wisely. But then when you gain power, that puts you in a problematic position. Ronald Reagan marked the beginning of the new conservative movement in the United States. He was elected in 1980. I'm sure most of you recognize Reagan. He's a very recognizable figure. And his election in 1980 was sort of the real launch of the conservative movement in the United States that we still have to today. Today's conservative movement looks very different than Ronald Reagan, but it's from the same lineage. It has the same history that goes with it. And Reagan really began this rhetoric, a rhetoric that we still remember to this day. These quotes are very easy to find. Everybody knows these quotes. The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Right? I mean, that's pretty strong language about governmental work. And then his most famous quote that was anti-government is, "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem." And so, at least rhetorically, this anti-government aspect of it is very significant even to this day. We see this, and I think I get to it in a second. I'm going to talk about how we see this even in modern day politics, that it's really at the core of what we look at. It gets dressed into other things, but it's an important piece to it, and it's an important way in which Republicans actually get elected. Okay, so those are these founding themes. There's other ones that we can look at, but these are 3 big ones. And you could probably already see ways in which this affects policy, right? If Americans don't like government, if they are overly individualistic and almost revolutionary, the nature of all the political commotion from our lots and lots of democracy, all has impact on how we develop policy. But there's one other big reform time, and this gets a little technical because it's probably stuff you're not aware of, but there have been a couple major reform periods in the United States, of which I would argue the biggest is the progressive era. And progressive at this time sort of meant change. It means a little something different today. And this is the time period of when we saw an expansion of great wealth disparities. It's similar to today, actually. Very wealthy people with a huge gap with lots of people that are poor at the time. This is where we get people like J. Paul Getty and Andrew Carnegie and the Rockefellers. So any of those kinds of names that might sound familiar to you all arise during this time, 1890s to 1930s. And the progressive era changed all aspects of life, from how women operate in society to how we regulate food production, but it really affected our politics and in particular called for a lot of direct democracy. In addition to passing the amendment that gave women the right to vote or recognized the right to vote, they had the right to begin, we just didn't recognize it. And this is where you can see what we call suffragettes, which are the women who would dress in white often and march for their right to vote. But in addition to that, we democratized many parts of our system. I don't really need to get into it too much, but it was a infusion of sort of more directly democratic sensibilities. But in particular, what we see, and this is the relationship to the policy part of it, is we see the rise of the social sciences. This is the time period of the birth of social sciences across the globe, really, but certainly in the major universities in Europe and in the United States. It starts in Europe, in the United States, it catches fire. And we see the rise of social sciences and the rise of the expert, right? The person who is sort of apolitical, but has expertise in the areas of policy and good governance. And you see what this creates is sort of a call for expert government skills and management separate from political and democratic noise. Not that the democracy wouldn't have input in on it, but that the expert would be the one who could solve these societal problems at the time. You see this clash between Tocqueville, remember the guy who solved this democracy and equality. And what Tocqueville saw was this huge infusion of opinion and citizen input into everything. So a clash between that and what the progressives saw as the need for much more deliberate decision-making, expertise, reasoned debate, and primarily amongst the learned, right? Amongst the elites. And that could be good for society. We could debate whether or not they were just trying to protect their elite interest. But in general, the idea of social sciences was that if we study this thing, we could find the one right way to do something, as opposed to a political process, which is we battle over it until we find the most acceptable way to do something. So one right way, progressives, acceptable way, democracy. And at the reality, of course, they're going to have to come together. This time period was also the end of what in the United States we call patronage, which was up until the late 1800s. In the United States, all government jobs, federal, state, and local, were handed out based on your party affiliation. That is, you were in charge of the streets of your town because you belonged to the party that was in power. Or your brother ran the local post office because you worked for the party that was in power and they appointed him to the post office. This, for reasons that aren't important for this talk, ends at least at the federal level, or largely ends at the federal level, starting in the late 1800s, and then slowly works its way through states and localities along the way. And what we get in its place is what we now call, and you're familiar with this, I'm sure, is the civil service. That is, professionals who are hired to do the administrative tasks of government, but they're hired ideally based on skills and testing and expertise. This is what we get, and this is where we get really the birth of modern public administration in the United States, is in the progressive era. It's also the birth of all the political science journals all start then. All the social science journals all start then. It's all at the beginning. And the main force on this is as a person who was an academic, a political scientist who later became president of the United States. It's a bad move, by the way. Never make a political scientist president of anything, never mind the United States. And he comes along, and Woodrow Wilson's a very complicated figure. He was an avowed racist, but he was a very acclaimed academic and was the president of Princeton University, governor of state of New Jersey, and then president of the United States. And Wilson writes in the late 1800s this really important piece that says we need to separate out politics and administration. He would say, what we have now is what you see on this. Politics and administration are too overlapped. There's too much politics and administration, and we haven't recognized the management necessity and the expertise needed to properly administer government. And we need to have good politics and we need to have good administration, but they need to be separated. So this is what we would call the politics administrative dichotomy. And Wilson advocates for this and calls for a separate study of public administration. Just like you have management schools, which were popping up at the time, and management theories for the private sector, we also need to be able to talk about the study of administration separately from politics. This is, most critics, most academics don't like Woodrow Wilson that much. And one reason is this, because we know politics and administration are never going to be like this. They're always going to be overlapped. Maybe they don't need to be as overlapped as that, but they're always going to overlap. And the reason why they're going to always overlap, and this will probably be something you will talk this semester about, is that public administrators have discretion, right? That is, there are things in which a public administrator must study and decide and implement separate from the law. And anytime you have public discretion, you have power. There's politics involved in it at some level. And so in this way, it becomes problematic in terms of how we think about it. Okay, so this brings us to today. I'm going to talk about a few things today. I'll try to go a little quicker or cut some things out so we have time for Q&A. But all of these themes, all these tensions I described are still in play today, along with a few others. In the United States, largely public administration and government bureaucracy is largely under attack. That is, that all those forces I talk about come together to have a very negative impact on public administration. Public administration in the United States is belittled, it's criticized, and it's seen as the root of many problems, even when they're not. In fact, they often are not the root of problems. They're actually the root of lots of success, but they're not seen that way. They're seen as what we would say in the United States, a punching bag. Like if you're a boxer and you punch like a punching bag. American style politics has absorbed this largely anti-government. Oh, I missed my Wilson quotes. That's okay though. We can read them later. American style politics has absorbed and taken to heart this largely anti-government, which largely means anti-public administrators, right? It's largely embraced this theme. And this is widely true when it comes, again, as I mentioned, to the Republican Party and their political rhetoric, but it can be true in both parties. It can be expressed in many traditional ways, like the lazy bureaucrat, the overpaid government employee, and often, at least in our country, the elite snobs, that somehow government bureaucrats and public administrators are better than you and know better than you. But it can also be indirectly expressed around issues of taxes and the size of government. That is, there are some people who want to pay, everybody wants to pay lower taxes. But there's some people that's a major deal. They want taxes to be lowered. And that's one way to express an anti-government sentiment. It's not just to say you're bums, but to say you take too much of my money. And we need to change that along the way. As stated earlier, much of this in the modern setting begins with Ronald Reagan, his election, but it becomes a mantra for several decades until we get the current version of anti-public administration, which is the phrase, drain the swamp. drain the swamp. And this is in some ways what we would call the United States a culture war issue. That is, it's not about policy, it's not about policy preferences, but it's about these symbolic things that there's no real way to legislate them, but if you take a stance on them, people agree to them. And cultural things have a lot of power in the United States and in all democracies, really. And Drains the Swamp embraces this anti-government, anti-elitist attitude. And Drain the Swamp is one of the major catchphrases of former President Donald Trump. It's one of the ways he got elected. If you attended a political rally of Donald Trump, at some point in the rally, they would chant, "Drain the swamp, drain the swamp," like you're at a soccer game, right? At some place along the way. This gets played out in what we call populism, which is a type of politics that plays on the fears of voters, and in particular, it plays on their sense that they are getting cheated or passed by, right? That is, someone, we would say, sticking it to me. That is, they're stealing from me somehow. And so populism plays off this piece. And so for Donald Trump, that populism says, the people, you're getting cheated, and you're being cheated by illegal immigrants and by the government. So we're going to build a wall and we're going to drain the swamp. Those are basically the only two issues that then candidate Trump campaigned on, both in his original election and his re-election. It's also sort of a victim's position. It is that you are getting cheated, but as I point out, but you're getting cheated by some other group. It's not your fault that I don't have enough money, or my kids can't get a job, or I can't send my kid to college. It's those immigrants that are here illegally, right? It's the government that is taking my tax money or over-regulating me, right? And so these things play into this populist moment, which we are in the United States. So Trump will say, you're getting cheated. I'm going to fix that. You're getting cheated by Mexicans and by the government to some degree, with the attempt at imposing a ban on certain Muslim countries from immigrating to the United States. We can even blame those groups. That was more of an issue around perceived security threats, and was resisted for a long time along the way. But these attacks have been going on for a long time, and for a while. We see them in a bunch of different ways. But along with this is also sort of a vast lack of knowledge of what government actually does, especially at the federal level, but really at all levels. We get several problems. One of these is what we call submerged government. That is, a lot of what the federal government does is below, what we say, below the radar, like behind the scenes. In the United States, the federal government often writes checks. That is, they pay the states to take care of programs. So we have programs for housing. We have programs for heating assistance. We have programs for free meals in schools. We have tons of these kinds of programs. Almost all of them are funded completely by the federal government, but they're implemented by state and local government. People receiving those benefits would have no idea the federal government gave them the money. And so we have a submerged government. So we don't really know what government does. And we think that everybody else is benefiting and I'm not at the end of the day. We also have the lack of journalism at the local level. That is, our news has become almost exclusively national in nature. And we don't have the kinds of investigative journalism and journalism that would inform citizens on local issues. It's much more sparse. It's much more difficult to track. And this sort of disengages individuals from policymaking and public administration at the local level. Again, the one that has the biggest impact on their life. We also have this issue, which every country has, which is the rise of sort of the digital age, bad and false information, just simply people feeling like, what if it's on the web, it must be true, especially if it matches up with my feelings. And in the United States, we also have this sort of blurring between what is government and what is private contracting. That is, in a resistance and an anti-government resistance to hiring more people to do what we need done, we tend to contract out, that is, hire private groups to do the work of government. And those lines have become very blurred to the point where we don't really know where the government stops and the private sector begins. Very problematic along the way. And this is all built back into, again, all the massive amounts of democracy and individualism and populism and anti-government rhetoric. And on top of this, we have increased hyper-partisanship, which fuels this anti-government sentiment. And again, back to this idea of you can't tell me what to do. Our hyper-partisanship in the United States, it, to me, is the greatest threat to our democracy. One of the top 2 or 3. It's most political scientists are really on edge. I would say they're fearful by the nature of the partisanship in our country. Something we've never really well, I shouldn't say never experienced, but it's been many generations since we've experienced it. And I think it's different than it was in the past that way. This sort of increased polarization means that there's lots of close splits in our electoral politics. It hypes up the tax on government. And we see this, for instance, in the Trump administration, where he gutted many parts of the federal government by just simply not hiring people and firing people and just simply not staffing government so it could do what it wants to do. There's a gentleman, a scholar by the name of Paul Light, who I highly recommend. I think he's at Columbia University now. And he refers to this as a government ill executed, which if you look at the quote at the bottom is he's referring to Alexander Hamilton, one of our founding fathers. You probably know the musical, maybe. The federal government this is Paul Light's quote. The federal government is having increasing difficulty to faithfully execute the laws, which is what Alexander Hamilton called the true test of a good government. That is the problem. I'm trying to get to my conclusion here. The problem with all of this is public administration and public administrators are an absolute key and essential part to any democracy. That is, you cannot have successful democracy without good public administration. And as has been documented by scholars, the founders themselves, Alexander Hamilton and others, repeatedly talk about the need for good public administration, the ability to do the will of the people. And this constant neglect and undermining and use of public administration as a political punching bag has made it almost impossible. It has made it impossible for administrators to fully execute the law as they're being asked. So you put those all together, we really have this problem where government is being hollowed out in very significant ways where we can't respond to things as well as we'd like. This pandemic is a good case in point. Natural disasters are a good case in point. Some would point to the very problematic departure out of Afghanistan as a case in point, not to mention many other social problems along the way. It is this link, this piece along the bottom, that citizens vote for and express preferences to elected officials. Elected officials write laws and approve spending so for public administrators to implement, and then that implementation, or sometimes lack of, has an impact on citizens. The loop has to be connected. If citizens have preferences and elect people based on it, and elected officials give the money and the laws to the public administrators to do it, and the public administrators can't do it, it breaks down. Citizens don't have faith in government. They stop paying their taxes. They can stop obeying government. It is a very problematic piece. And in the United States, public administration is completely under attack within this. It is a weird thing because it's driven by this love-hate relationship with government. I'm sure that's not the baby's knuckles. I don't think it's been tattooed. In any case, love-hate relationship with the government. We blame it, we curse it, we claim it's a threat to our liberty. But when we want something done, we turn to it. And why is that the case? Because government, at least in the United States, is actually pretty good at doing what we need it to do, as long as you properly fund it and support it and legislate it and allow it to do what it needs to do. If you don't, it actually becomes what you say it is. It actually becomes bad government. It'll undermine the very thing you need it to do, to make collective decisions, to design and implement policy, protect your freedoms, protect your property, and generate public goods. You cannot have honest, representative, healthy democracies without good, well-supported, appreciated public administration. The link breaks. And I don't have to tell you, Indonesia has many excellent features of democracy, but the ones you struggle with the most are what? Corruption, endemic corruption on a local and a regional level, right? These are problematic, and lots of countries have that, by the way, not just Indonesia. But if you look at all the great aspects of Indonesia, they rival any other country. You have a robust party system, the whole bit. But at least from my understanding from academics and the stuff I read, you have an issue with this piece. And ours is a different one. It's not usually corruption. It's around other things, but it still can be the thing that undermines your democracy. And so what I want to say to you as you sort of begin this early path, this is my understanding that you're starting off on this early path towards serving the people of your communities and your country, is to never forget, and it's hard, you will want to forget, but never forget how important the link between citizens, elections, and administration is, and how, as a public servant, as the public administration, as we call it, you are essential to the health of your democracy, the health and freedom of your people. It's hard to remember this because you're going to be in some little office in some place and it's going to not seem important to you. But if you have to remember, you will have many days when you don't see your work as valuable. But for free nations, for democracies to survive, they rely on you to remember your value even when others don't. That is certainly true here in the US. That is true in other long-standing democracies like Great Britain and Germany, Canada, Japan. And it is true here in your country of Indonesia, a great land with great people who have had dramatic transformation of their country over many decades. And you continue to do so every day by people just like you. Thank you for your time. I'll take any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That's very nice closing. Yeah, very nice word for your closing. Do you mind if I translate a little bit of your presentation?
Please, yes, please do.
Because many of our participants do not speak English very well. Oke, jadi ini saya akan sedikit ringkas begitu ya. Tadi ceramahnya Pak Lonce itu bahwa ini tadi topiknya kan tentang administrasi publik dan kebijakan ya di dalam konteks politik ya. Jadi poin-poin utama dari presentasi Pak Bailey adalah tentang demokrasi ya, bahwa Amerika ini merupakan negara federalisme dengan 50-an negara bagian dan puluhan local government gitu ya, yang mempunyai banyak persamaan tapi juga banyak independensi gitu ya antar mereka. Dan demokrasi itu sudah merupakan sesuatu yang esensial gitu ya sejak awal Amerika itu berdiri. Nah, Tocqueville tadi ada seorang tokoh yang berasal dari Prancis dan kemudian mempelajari dan kemudian menulis buku tentang demokrasi di Amerika, dan dia menulis bahwa orang Amerika itu merasa bahwa mereka itu mempunyai persamaan gitu ya, jadi equality ya, harusnya mereka itu mempunyai kedudukan yang sama gitu. Dan di Amerika itu oleh karena itulah maka berbeda dengan di Perancis. Kalau di Perancis itu hanya ada pemerintah begitu, tapi di Amerika itu ada banyak asosiasi karena orang masing-masing mempunyai pendapat yang berbeda-beda begitu. Kemudian setelah demokrasi adalah individualisme. Jadi menurut ide individualisme ini adalah bahwa warga negara itu merupakan penguasa gitu ya, menjadi bos gitu. Dan kemudian kewenangan pemerintah itu berasal dari individu-individu yang kemudian bersedia menyerahkan sebagian dari kewenangan yang mereka punyai gitu ya pada pemerintah. Dan ini sangat kentara pada waktu Presiden Trump itu kemudian bisa memenangkan presidensi di Amerika. Banyak orang pada waktu itu kaget ya, kenapa yang mungkin secara kapasitas pribadi itu agak unik gitu ya, tetapi berhasil menjadi pemimpin di Amerika itu karena kampanye-kampanyenya yang mengatakan I alone can fix it gitu ya. Pokoknya hero gitu ya, menjadi hero, bahwa saya sendiri itu bisa mengatasi semua masalah, dan itu jagoan ya, semangat jagoan itulah yang disukai oleh orang Amerika, sehingga ada tentang Rambo gitu ya. Rambo itu kan jagoan gitu ya, dia satu orang tetapi di film itu walaupun diserang oleh banyak musuh tapi dia tetap menjadi pemenang gitu ya. Nah, itulah semangat Rambo, itulah yang kemudian menguasai di Amerika ya. Dan itu berasal dari ide Protestan ya, yang mengatakan bahwa kalau aku bekerja keras maka aku akan berhasil. Nah, itu ya. Dan kemudian yang ketiga adalah equality ya, bahwa kembali hampir mirip dengan individualisme, bahwa semua orang mempunyai kedudukan yang sama. Jadi kalau orang bekerja keras itu maka orang akan bisa mencapai sukses. Dan yang keempat ada semangat distrust gitu ya, ketidakpercayaan pada pemerintah, sehingga muncul pendapat bahwa anti pemerintah dan lain sebagainya. Jadi ini menarik sekali, sampai kemudian berkembang menjadi public administration yang sekarang, bahwa orang itu ada sebagian orang Amerika yang tidak percaya pada pemerintah sehingga nggak mau pakai masker ya, karena aneh pandemi orang melawan pemerintah nggak mau pakai masker dan seterusnya, itu sangat kuat. Nah, ini akan menarik didiskusikan ya terkait dengan Indonesia, karena Amerika kampion demokrasi, tetapi tadi kata Pak Lonce bahwa kita itu juga demokrasi tapi kita punya banyak korupsi. Ya, ini dia menariknya. Oke, jadi saya buka question and answer dan saya akan lihat dari chat. Ada pertanyaan dari Pak Budi Pospo from the chat room. Yeah, I will read it. Pak Bailey, the spirit of from Pak Budi Pospo, the spirit of individualism seems kok hilang. Sebentar. The spirit of individualism seems to have strong roots in the US. Does it then also affect the development of public administration science? Yeah, sebentar ini kok saya kok the spirit of individualism seems to have strong roots in the US. Does it then also affect the development of public administration science in the US? While in Indonesia is stronger in terms of the spirit of collectivism. Does it mean that we need to be careful if we adopt public administration science from the US? So with a different background. So what is your opinion about that?
So, this is in my classes, I would say there's a spectrum from collective deference or preference given to a collective versus the individual, right? And so individualism, collectivism, right? Or some communitarianism, right? Kind of idea that the community is important. And we might say in democracies, it's somewhere around here. That is, the individuals in a classically liberal society, individuals have rights. They have rights before the law. They have rights before government. Some have more rights than others. The rights can be different. And so democracy being here, in the United States, we're like over here. That is, the individual rights are by, I think, almost every measure, largely sort of, I don't want to say extreme, but much more severe. So for instance, to give you an example, I don't have a good Indonesian example, but for instance, in Germany, you cannot start a Nazi party, right? You can't go and say, I want to start the Adolf Hitler party. In France, in the United States, you could do that. I could walk out into my campus right now and talk about the virtues of Adolf Hitler if I wanted to, and I'd be protected by the government. We have that's an extreme version of it. So even though that's bad for society, that's very bad for society. For the individual, we see the individuals being more important than the society in many cases. And we see this in things like France. We see the requirements to remove the hijab, right, in schools and stuff like that. That's in the United States. You might get resistance culturally around it, but in terms of laws, that would not be allowed, really. But in France, that would be allowed, right? There's different ways. Speech, for instance, is a big part of that. Okay, but your question was about, does it affect how we think about policy or the study of a science? And I guess my quick answer is no. We are always looking for good ways in which to solve the problems that are presented to public administrators. And in that way, the individualism affects our choices of how we can solve things, what is acceptable, what is seen as sort of normal or expected is dictated by our political and cultural context within it. Government solves, and this is why we train public administrators, government solves is what one organizational theorist calls wicked problems. So I don't know if wicked translates, but wicked think of as evil, but really what they mean is difficult problems. The private sector doesn't deal with difficult
very complex.
problems. They deal with wicked problems. And so how you solve those are complex. So I'll give you an example of wicked problems. Homelessness. That's a problem we're never going to completely solve. It has there's no way to make money doing it. So the private sector doesn't solve homelessness. So the government has to solve it. But how we would solve homelessness here and how you might address homelessness in Indonesia or in Italy or somewhere else is completely different. In the United States, our rugged individualism makes citizens resistant to the idea of giving people money or building housing. They don't like that idea. They kind of feel like if you want housing, go get a job.
Work hard.
Yeah, I saw this just yesterday. I'm going to tell you right now, this is it. I was at the grocery store, big grocery store, and I noticed a guy, young guy, 25, 30 years old. He got the business card from the manager of the grocery store. And she said, "Can I help you with something?" And he said, "Well, there's a woman in the parking lot begging for money. And I want to let her know you guys are hiring. She should just get a job." And so he went out and handed her the business card. Now, okay, that's a reasonable thing. There are jobs in the United States. You can get jobs. They don't always pay well. But if you're a public administrator, you know it's much more complicated. She might have children. She might have mental illness. She may not have a place to live. No place like a grocery store is going to hire you if you don't have a home address, if you don't have a cell phone, and if you can't come to work showered with your kids somewhere else, right? And so it's complicated. So the public administrator has to deal with that. But as a public administrator, I have to say to myself, lots of citizens think just like that guy. So how am I going to get something working in which citizens are okay with? And so to that extent, it changes. Your solutions are radically different. So for instance, religion in your society is fully embraced, right? You have the largest Muslim population in the world. It's integrated into your politics. And so you may find that some of your solutions are maybe more exclusively religious, or that government and religion can solve problems together. In the United States, we do some of that, but there's a resistance to that because part of our system is a separation of those things. And so we tend to not allow for that. We do in some ways, but it's very structured in that way. So it affects our solutions, but I don't necessarily think it affects our training.
Okay, thank you very much for your, can understand that. Every public administration must think about like comprehensively, not just the thing that citizen or the ordinary citizen see something, but the public administration has to see everything comprehensively in all aspects. So in terms of the environment is very important.
Yes, that's right.
So and I have a question for you. If you say that people say that public administration in the US can be said is under attack, so how about related this job? Do people will be proud to be a government official, or is the job as a government officer is something that people dream of, or is something that people don't like?
Excellent question. And I would love to hear how it is in Indonesia. I would say if you talk to people that work for the government, that they're mostly proud of their work and they see their work as very fulfilling. There's many kinds of work that you can only do in the government. If you want to go arrest bad guys, right, and you want to solve crimes, you have to work for the government. If you want to educate kids, you mostly have to work for the government, right? But most would see it themselves as good. I would say, though, that the there, without a doubt, and that book I mentioned, Paul Light's book, he documents it. There is a decline in individuals, especially trained individuals, college degrees and stuff like that, going into the public service, going into public administration. And part of that is, in fact, I have a colleague here who researches this. Part of it has to do with the status of it, the fact that people see government officials in a negative light. What happens is, so yes, it undermines it. It makes it difficult to recruit. At the federal level, it's a unique problem because the federal level government is largely what we call white collar employees. So we have large numbers of PhDs at the federal government, lots of researchers, high level management stuff. So it's hard to recruit in that because first of all, they can make a lot more money in the private sector. And then there's a status issue by the public sector. But the problem is this, and you see this in many things, and I think this is one of those universal things, and that is sort of the general versus the particular. So if you say to someone, what do you think about the government and its ability to do things or to deliver on things? You would say they're terrible. They're lazy and they waste money and they're inefficient. But if you ask them about their specific interactions with the government, they're very high level. They're really appreciative. They see it as working well. So on a general level, you are trained in some ways to see the government as wasteful and cold, but your individual experiences when we measure them are all very positive. And so it's one of those weird things where an individual working for the government feels good about it. Their interactions with individual citizens are good, but the cultural aspect to it is negative. This is especially true for like my students. We have an undergraduate public administration program in addition to a master's in public administration. And it's hard to recruit students to go into public administration because they don't want to say to their families and friends, I want to go work for the government. So it's a problem, but it is a big problem in terms of recruiting and maintaining human resources. So it's a very big issue. Yeah.
It's just happened recently, or it has been happening since in the past?
I would say.
Is there any trend?
Yeah, good question. I'd have to look at it closely, but I would say certainly that has been the case since about the 1970s until now. Following World War II, yeah. So once we have the Great Society, not the Great Society, the New Deal. So FDR, World War II, the Great Depression, government expands dramatically in terms of all the services they provide. And from during World War II and the victory in World War II and the few decades after it, I think there is a positive idea about working for the government. And then this starts changing in the 1970s. And then when Reagan comes in, this anti-government sentiment really abuses, this really messes up government service. It's a major problem. Recruiting in government services, it takes a lot of time and effort, and they fall short often.
It doesn't have a relation with the salary. I mean, working in the government is getting less salary than working in the private sector, for instance. Is there any difference in that?
Yes, there is. For the most part, at the high end, lots of difference. So if I'm a PhD, I am a PhD. If I was working for the government, I do work for the state government, but like a regular public administrator job, I'd be underpaid for what I would get paid in the private sector. On the low end, if I'm a custodian or I'm a clerk, I'm getting paid more than I would in the private sector. The advantage of, and so my colleague who researches this will point a few things. One is the pay isn't the only thing they consider. So why would someone with a PhD, one of my close friends works for the Environmental Protection Agency, and he has a master's degree, he's a trained scientist. He could probably double his salary if he went into the private sector. But the government's the only place in which he can do what he thinks is honorable and good work. And there's a little bit of a status that is, in some circles, he's seen as that's a good thing to be doing. But then he also has job security. It's difficult to fire him unless he's incompetent, which he's not. And it also has lots of interesting opportunities to work with other people. So the benefits come from other things other than money. But it is still a problem, especially when you're entering in. Right? So if you're working for the private sector and you want to move, and you're at a high level position, you want to move to the government sector, you have to take a pay cut. And that's sometimes hard for people to do.
Okay.
Yeah, pay is definitely. Is
Very
that true in Indonesia? There's difference in pay. Are government jobs good paying jobs?
In Indonesia, many people still want to become a government official, but not as much as it was before. Now people see more benefit in working with the private sector, or they have their own business because of the development of the digital era. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So the trend is not as the becoming the government official is not that popular as it was before, but still many people want to become a government official because it gives a security. Yeah. It's difficult to fire them. Yeah. Right. So it's in this very turbulent era. That's very interesting.
Yeah. It's one of these things, like when you're young, the idea of stability and security is not as important. But then you get a little older, like me, and you have kids, right? And you worry about your house. Now all of a sudden, security. Like I never thought I would care about having tenure as a faculty member. But now that I have tenure and I got 2 daughters and all that, having that, not having to worry about that is a big deal.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So all you young people out there, you should worry about that.
Yeah.
Big crowd, it's almost 200 people listening in on this. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, because I have asked my students, and very few that they say that they want to become government officials. Yeah, right. Yeah, it surprised me actually.
In the United States, we turn to marketing. So what we just changed the name of our major from public administration to public service. Because in addition to government, we do some stuff about nonprofit work as well, because nonprofits and governments work together. And so we get a lot of students who want to go and help people and they want to do good in the world, but they don't know what public administration is. That sounds boring and not very interesting. But public service, now that sounds interesting. And so all of a sudden you get people who are like, once you have a chance to explain to them the kinds of things you can do in the government or nonprofit partnerships with the government, there's a lot of good that can be done in the world. And so that's, to me, the connection is that more than ever, my students want to go out and do good in the world. They're not as, when I was an undergrad, it was about making money. It was the 1980s. All the movies were about making money and being a big capitalist and going to Wall Street. And that's still a big force today. But there's a lot of people who just really want to go out and solve the world's problems. They don't want to see little kids being hungry. They want people to have health insurance. They want to deal with the environment and global warming. They want to stop wars. And so when you explain to them that the kind of study of administration is part and parcel of that, I think they buy into it. They realize that that's the case.
Okay. Thank you very much for the answer. We have a question from.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, sorry. Well, we have a question from Ulina Anfusa, and she asks what strategic measures should be taken to preserve intellectual sovereignty of the state in the knowledge of public administration sector?
Boy, I'm not sure I understand the question. So can you rephrase that? So are you talking about, I don't think I fully understand the question.
Maybe the student can ask in Bahasa Indonesia and then Bu Hartuti can translate it in English. Ulina.
Oke, Ma'am.
Ya.
Jadi saya mau bertanya langkah-langkah strategis apa yang harus diambil untuk menjaga kedaulatan intelektual negara di bidang administrasi publik.
What measures should be taken to prevent the intellectual sovereignty of the state in the sphere of public administration?
Yeah, if you're talking about,
Yeah.
are you talking about like intellectual property rights, or are you talking about?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm not an expert on international property rights, international, intellectual property rights, not international property rights. It is a major issue, and it's a major issue in the United States, especially in its relationship to China, but to other parts of the world as well. But in terms of China, and again, I have a limited understanding, so excuse my assumptions if I'm making it, but what is pretty well documented large-scale theft of intellectual property from the United States. The reason why it's such a big deal, besides the fact that it's theft of intellectual property rights, is that the United States economy is heavily invested in around intellectual property. We don't make things anymore, right? So we invent things and design scientific discoveries and things like this. And that's a massive part of our economy. And so for it to be sort of wholesale stolen by other countries or by other entities, very problematic. That does plug into public administration, no doubt, more in the world of law enforcement and national security administration, which is all part of public administration. And so they play a massive role in it, because it is the only way that kind of stuff's going to stop, or the primary way that's going to stop, is through relationships between governments. In other words, the thing that could stop China from stealing our intellectual property, besides increased security, is the Chinese government saying that, cracking down on it. The Chinese government could certainly slow down intellectual property theft if it wanted to. And so the question is, can the U.S. convince them that they want to? So yeah, it plays a role, but I'm not as familiar with that role as others. That's a great question, though. That's, boy, young people, they know to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
been an issue
Thank
for
you
a long
very much.
time. Movies, all our cultural stuff, movies, music, this kind of stuff. But really, in the recent last few decades, it's more around inventions and technology and scientific development, pharmaceuticals, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry, Pak Lonce. Bu Hana told me that your time is limited, and I think that we don't have time more, because
Okay.
it's 20:30 already. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Very welcome.
Very nice, very interesting. Yeah, very bright. Yeah, it gives us lots of understanding on the politics and public administration in the US, and we can understand more on what we read and what we see in the news. Yeah, about the American people. Yeah, and thank you very much again, and then hopefully that we will see you again in the next future. Yeah, and thank you very much.
Next time I'll come there.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'd love to come to Indonesia anytime.
Please do come to Indonesia. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. We would love to have you. We would love to have you. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for those who have given questions to Dr. Lonce Bailey. And now I will return the time to Ibu Retna Hanani. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bu Hartuti. Lonce told me that he has to go. So is it what is it, definite time, or you still have some time?
I have 5 minutes. I got to leave in 5 minutes.
Oh, you got to leave in 5 minutes.
That's very American. I got to leave in 6 minutes. We do that. Do you do that in Indonesia? 6 minutes.
6 minutes. Okay.
No, we just do that. Not 5 minutes, but 6. Yeah.
Hana,
okay.
2, 3.
Okay. Because now I just received a message from the administrator that we need to take group pictures. So that will take 6 minutes for the group to take good pictures together.
Okay.
And we also would like to ask you if you are willing to share your PPT presentations, because it's really
I'll
good.
send it to you. I'll email it to you in a little bit. It'll be a little later today, but I'll email it to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, because some of the students, they asked me to explain again, and maybe in Bahasa Indonesia, to recall some of the lectures that you have given. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
Great.
So
Great to see you. It was lovely to see you along the way.
yes, yeah. I really wish we could, meeting offline and having a good time, either in United States or in Semarang.
Absolutely. Let me take a picture of you while I got you right there so I can show you off to everybody. Everybody's gonna be jealous. Everybody else that hung out with you. But I appreciate it anytime. And we can do informal conversations too. If you just want to do a Q&A and we can go back and forth. I have students here too, so anytime I can be helpful. Thank you very much.
So, Mas Amni, are we ready for the pictures or it's
Okay,
already
let me ask Miss Cynthia. Halo, Mbak Cynthia.
This is very important part of the
Bisa diambil gambarnya, Mbak? Halo, Mbak Cynthia.
Hello, Mas Amni.
Yeah.
Okay. Before I take the picture, please open your camera. I will count 1, 2, 3 to take a picture. Okay.
1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3. Once again, 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I think as an informal MC, I would like to say thank you again for a very insightful presentation. I had a lot of questions actually, especially about the distrust to government and etc. But I think it's a very good start for to have this kind of conversation with Lonce again after such a long time of not communicating, and we hope that this kind of conversation will continue in near future. We have many kinds of programs that we would like to pursue, for example, joint research in order to create research cooperation between Universitas Diponegoro and other universities. And I believe what you have mentioned earlier, it's really inspiring to see that level of distrust to government is everywhere. I can see as well in Indonesia that the distrust to government is quite severe, but unfortunately it doesn't lead to more accountability. The government somehow just left the citizens out of the blue and they just do whatever they want. And exactly like you said, the corruption is also part of this, of the impact of distrust to government, that somehow citizens, feel frustrated. They cannot check the government accountability and the government doesn't feel that they have to be accountable to citizens. So of course, the link that you explain in your presentations, the link is broken. Yeah, but of course, it will take another guest lecture from Lonce and maybe other Indonesianist public administrator, so that we can really compare on that topic itself. But I feel really great that we have Lonce to be opening lecture for this course this semester. I feel very privileged that I could learn from Lonce again. And sorry, I keep calling you Lonce. It feels so impolite. Yeah,
it's fine. You're fine. It's totally fine. I'm good.
In Indonesia, we have to call you Dr. Bailey, and of course, you are Dr. Bailey.
I'll make my students call me that.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, I remember that. So, yeah. Otherwise, we will call you Pak Lonce when you visit Semarang one day.
Used to call me Crazy Lonce, Gila Lonce.
Aduh, that won't be happening here. That won't be happening. Okay. Good. Thank you again, Lonce, for sharing with us, and we hope to stay in touch with you. And of course, any comments from you will be very much welcome. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me. Have a great day and good luck this semester.
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for all the students that attended the class. And of course, we'll have further discussion during our term. And one thing that I would like to encourage the students to ask questions and to think critically, and I hope this lecture is a good nudge. Nudge itu artinya poke ya, is a good start to start thinking public administration in a more critical and comparative way. Thank you and have a good evening. I would like to close the session. Thank you very much, Mas Ami, Ibu Cynthia, Mas Pur for helping us organizing the guest lecture. Have a good rest and see you in the next meeting. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Waalaikumsalam
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.